use the small faucet that's right outside the room.
No, I went around to
The big one. It's a lot easier. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to the seminar today. The seminar today is going to be about how to prepare a nice presentation if you're making a talk at a large conference. Our speaker is Amit Pradhananga. Probably didn't say that right, sorry. He has a PhD in NRSM from the University of Minnesota. And he studies the human dimensions of natural resources management. So thank you very much for agreeing to make this talk today.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here today. And anyone online, let me know if you have a hard time hearing me. Is there a way they would chat? Okay. All right. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to prepare presentations for conferences, as well as presentations for other types of audiences. I do a lot of presentations, primarily actually for different types of stakeholder groups. So it might be decision makers at state agencies. There's a lot of interest oftentimes in the work that I do around water management from local governments. So counties, watershed districts, soil and water conservation districts have a lot of interest in understanding the human dimensions. And so I do a lot of those presentations as well. So there's always a slight bit of difference between doing conference presentations and stakeholder presentations, largely based on the type of audience that you might see. So as in any presentation, I'm hoping that this will provide you some useful tips on how to better prepare presentations for different types of settings. This is by no means kind of an exhaustive lesson on how to do presentations. So my hope here today is everything will go exactly as I planned it, which is the top section of this figure here. So let me know if I end up doing this instead of how I planned it. A lot of times you do presentations and oops, there's something here that points to the technical difficulty stuff. Let's snooze it. All right. So hopefully what I will present today will be useful tips in terms of how to do presentations. I'm going to be talking about the content piece and the design piece a little bit more than delivery of presentations. So here it goes. So as in any presentation, I try to look at a presentation as three different aspects. So there's putting together the actual content. And with the content, I'm not thinking so much the actual slides that you might put together for a presentation, but the content, meaning the material that you'll be talking about at a presentation. And then secondly, a little bit about some few design tips that I've had the opportunity to learn over the years from different sources, classes and different people that have provided a lot of input on presentations. And then the third piece is the actual delivery piece that I won't be going into a whole lot except for maybe a few pointers. So in terms of content, I'm sure you would have heard this quite a bit. Just know your audience. I think the first key point is knowing who's going to be at your presentation. And so this is me trying to make a bit of a guess based on who my audience is going to be today, primarily grad students. And I've been a grad student before, and we love memes. And so I'm using a meme here to get my point across that you do need to know your audience quite a bit. So try to know who the audience is. So I was talking about, stakeholders. So it might be a watershed manager. It might be a very technical kind of a resource professional who's coming to your presentation when you're doing stakeholder presentations. So for them, going into a lot of details about how exactly I'm doing my social science methodology, the statistics I'm using, although important to point out, may not have to be the focus of your presentation, right? They're really interested in learning about what is this thing called human dimensions and how can I use it in my work? So put a lot more focus on that end rather than talking about your supercalifragilistic, super cool methods that you're using. Right, so again, think about what your audience is going to care most about. What do they really want to get out of this presentation? Otherwise, we might end up putting them to sleep. Hopefully not all of them. So again, think about why your audience is there. So at a conference where you might have academics, for example. So I go to one of the biggest conferences in my subdiscipline around human dimensions is called the International Symposium for Society and Resource Management, which is attended by a lot of academics in my field. So a presentation I do there might look a little different than a presentation that I might do at a watershed board meeting. So again, the difference might be that for academics, I might focus a lot more on the psychological theories that I'm using for my analysis, whereas at a board meeting, I might focus more on, what can you really do with this information? What recommendations would I have? The other key point here too is, I think oftentimes as researchers and grad students, we might have the tendency to try to do anything and everything with one presentation. So really check yourself and think about, do I really need to say this? Do I really need to get this really minute point across? What are my big messages? What I oftentimes like to do when I start putting together a presentation is think about, what it is that I'm going to be talking about. So what's the real core content piece? So it might be a research project. But then also talk about, so what did you do for your research project? What problems is this project addressing? But also, why is this important? Like, who would really care? Like, why should people care about what you're doing? What is the significance of your work? And so that kind of goes into the so what, right? So you found out X influences Y and a bunch of great stuff, but who really cares? Like, what is the significance of this finding? What does it really mean, and what does your audience have to do with it, and how can they use that information? So I try to craft my core messages. So here maybe are my 3 key things that I want my audience to remember from this presentation. And so for today, hopefully it is that really think about the what, why, and so what questions when you're putting together your content for your presentation. So again, when you're doing this, I would say, don't have 100 different messages you're trying to transmit through one presentation. Really focus on maybe up to 3 key messages. You might have a lot of details that help you build up to those key messages, but really have this core set of messages that even if they forgot everything about your presentation, they would be able to take home 3 key messages, key things that you want your audience to remember about your presentation. And so to do this, oftentimes what I like to do is I like to think of a structure for my presentation. So if I'm presenting my research project, for example, if I did a survey of landowners trying to understand how they're making decisions about using different types of conservation practices, I might think about, okay, so what are these 3 key things that I really want my audience to know about landowners' decision-making process based on the data that I have? Again, it's the idea of kind of trying to reduce and cut out unnecessary details and thinking about, here's these 3 big things based on asking myself, what did I do? Why is it important? And so what is the significance of what I did? I usually start out with, before I even go to a computer and start putting together slides, it's really easy for me to get lost in making slides. So I'd like to have, just write down an outline for my presentation after I figure out what my core messages are gonna be. A lot of people also, I think, like to use Post-its to try to organize their outline, and each Post-it might be a key message, or building up to details. I've tried this a couple of times. I really like doing it, but I just found that it's a whole lot easier for me to just work off of an outline that I don't need a huge whiteboard for. So I do also want to have a few activities while we go through this. So one of the first things I'd like you to think about, and we'll only take a few minutes just to break the kind of the lecture mode here. So think about any presentation that you might be doing in the near future. It might be the Water Resources Conference. It might be like a brown bag that you might be doing at an agency, a conference presentation, a presentation that you might be doing for this seminar series or other seminars. And really think about, write down on a piece of paper, who do you think the primary audience is going to be for this presentation? What do you think that audience would care about? What do they want to know about? What information would they most want out of your presentation? And maybe one idea about how can you tailor your content for that audience based on the research presentation that you're going to be doing. Let's take maybe about 2 minutes for this. Real quick thinking. Right, so anyone willing to share? Any volunteers? Yes.
So I was thinking of WRC, and I think based on attending last year, a lot of the audience seemed to be, you had a lot of researchers, but you also had a lot of people from watershed management organizations. And at least when you're talking about WMOs or the city public works departments or anything, the a lot of ways, they're always providing a service, and that's what they're focused on. So making sure that you put your content into a little more of a human perspective and a service perspective might engage them a little bit more.
Okay, sure. Thanks so much. Is there have you thought about that in terms of how you might translate your research into kind of the service mode? Do you have an example that you could share with us?
So the research I'm doing is with a public works department addressing road salt use. And I presented recently at a conference and I was only given 3 minutes. I made sure to give one major takeaway, which kind of echoed some things that were mentioned by the keynote speakers earlier in the day, which is having multi-level meetings as far as management levels, bringing in your top management to talk with people who are on the ground and actually have to deal with these issues, and making sure to say that we observed a lot of progress just based on meetings like that.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much. Any other examples? Maybe with a different type of audience? I should say I also teach every now and then, so I'm pretty comfortable just kind of pointing at people if there are no volunteers. Last call for volunteers. I'm going to pick on Casey.
So mine isn't necessarily too much of a different audience. So what I was thinking about when I guess to start this activity is next week I'm going to present at the 3-minute thesis competition. And so I guess the audience is people in academia at various levels with various interests. So I'm not entirely sure what the panel's made up of yet, but if it goes beyond that, then it could be a panel from anyone in the graduate schools, I think, from my understanding. So, yeah. And so figuring out what they care about, since it is people who are generally educated to some degree, but have such various background, I kind of took it to the basic level. They can care about the condition of the lakes that are in the state and then the ecosystem services provided by those lakes.
Okay, great. And is there a way you've thought about tailoring your content perhaps?
I have not gotten that far yet.
All right. Okay, great. Thanks so much. All right, so next up is the design piece that I've been trying to spend a lot of time in, and this is almost sometimes ends up being kind of a rabbit hole where you spend so much time on design that you forget about your content. So definitely don't do that. But design is becoming such a critical piece of how you do your presentations. One thing I definitely like to stress is that any design you do, any slides you put together, again, are meant to be visual aids for you. It's not supposed to be the center of the show, right? So you're supposed to be the center of attention for a presentation because you're the speaker. The slides that you put together are only supposed to be things that aid you in getting the point across. And in that sense, design becomes really important. So one of the first tips I got from years before, especially taking classes in public speaking and going through the preparing future faculty kind of courses is don't use templates. Don't use the standard PowerPoint templates. I know they've become a lot better lately than they used to be, but still they don't really show creativity. So I have this slide from that Sarah Fellows, my colleague who I work with, put together. She used to work at the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District, and oftentimes you get this with organizations. Oftentimes you get this with the university where they want you to use a template. And templates are evil is kind of the motto here. They kind of kill creativity. They kind of force these very specific set of colors and fonts and specific set of design, where you can place things, what sizes they can be. they just throw in the logo for there for no real purpose. It really doesn't really add anything to the message you're trying to get across, except keep repeating with every slide that I'm from this place. So again, it starts becoming very distracting. I try to avoid it as much as I can unless I'm explicitly told you have to do this, in which case there's no choice. The University of Minnesota, I found a few different logos. This is actually not so bad because it still leaves you a lot of room to do a bit of design work. But sometimes the colors and color combinations may not be the best. And it is taking up a lot of space, right? And so I try not to use it as much as I can. The other point about slides and slide design is, I think this misconception that you should be limited to a certain number of slides. I do get that from certain conference standpoint that you want to tell your participants to limit yourself to 20 slides because it's like a 20-minute presentation. Generally, the assumption is a slide is like 1 minute to 2 minutes. Sometimes that becomes necessary because otherwise you might have folks who put in like 40 slides with so much content in each one of them, then instead of being a 15-minute presentation, it becomes a 50-minute presentation. But I think that the goal really should be, how much time do I really have? And what is the most efficient and effective way to get my message across, and not about limiting yourself to a X number of slides. And besides, slides nowadays are free, right? It's only a click away. You don't really have to pay for getting additional slides. So use as many slides as you need, but be mindful of how you're using those slides. What I try to limit myself to do is to have only one message per slide. This also forces you to really focus on the message that the audience is seeing, and the audience is not skipping ahead of you. If you had bullet points with 6 different messages on, by the time you're done with point 1, the audience is looking at point 4, right? So you're not really in sync with the audience. It's always good practice to try to limit yourself to only one message with as few words as possible up on your slide. So when you have bullet points, for me as an audience member, this is what I'm seeing is the speaker just going blah, 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 with a whole bunch of things just up on the slide. So if, to contrast, if I'm looking at this, that defines a presentation. This is a standard bullet point list. An alternative to this might be creating something that looks more like an infographic that is a bit more visually engaging to the audience. It's easy to see, it's more pleasing on the eye, it's also easier to follow. You know now that there are these 6 points that define a presentation. Or 5 points. I'm bad at counting. I'm a qualitative scientist as well. One of the other misconceptions sometimes, I think among us scientists too, is that what we do is just so complex and it's so scientific that it's not possible to do good design with the messages that we have. And to a certain extent, that is true, right? So if you look at, you Google a lot of examples of slide design, they're about very largely simplistic things. The examples do not always resonate with what types of messages that you might have, especially if you're trying to do a research presentation. But there are many different ways that you can move away from the bullet point. And so that's kind of my presentation principle for this year is for every presentation that I do, I'm trying to commit myself to not use bullet points at all and try to find some other alternative. So this one does still have quite a bit of text, but then it's, in terms of design, it's neatly laid out. There's spaces between the big contents. They're using icons. There's a lot of different combinations of strategies that you might use. They're using different types of fonts, some in caps, some not in caps. Sometimes people tend to frown at cap locks, but I think they're fine. So this might go a little bit more to from design to delivery as I'll just let you read this stuff. right? So you don't have to put everything on the slide. And if you do, then like, why are you even here? We can just read the slide. The other thing too is, again, the point about getting away from templates too is that the nice thing is it then allows you to start using different kinds of fonts. So you can play around with different fonts, different colors to try to emphasize key points. So if you're a scientist looking at significant differences between group A and group B in whatever the outcome might be, you can highlight those aspects of those differences more clearly using maybe a different font or a different size font or different colors, which oftentimes with templates, it's very, very hard to do. And again, the all caps, sometimes if you're trying to really emphasize a message, it works well. I think it really depends on the context. If you're using all caps in a text, that might be a little bit more like yelling at someone. But if you use it well on a slide where you're trying to get a big point across and use it with good design, that it works really well. The other thing that I always fall back on in terms of design, if I don't find any other way of doing anything, is using really good images. There's a lot of resources that you can use to find really high quality images. The other thing I like to do as well with images is, and I see this a lot where we might have a little bit of text thrown in and we might have like a picture that's resized to be smaller for some reason. If unless there's an explicit need to do it this way, for me, this looks much better. There's more clarity in the slide. The message is loud and clear. It might depend on what kind of images you might want to have on there. The one thing though about using images is it doesn't just make sense to like throw a whole bunch of nice pictures on there to just be running in the background. It has to be related to your message somehow. So for a scientist, it might end up being a lot of charts, right? Or it might end up being a blank slide with your findings. The other design idea that I really like, there's 1,000 of these recommendations. That I really like, one of these is if you have an image in the background, oftentimes having text on top of it gets really difficult. So I just throw in some transparent background. So I have like a fill-in color for the text box or the shape, and then use the transparency function on your PowerPoint to make it stand out a little bit. There's also different kinds of tools that can help you figure out different color combinations that you might want to use. So if I have a blue background, what kind of color might work for my text? So you don't always have to be an expert at knowing colors and art. One of these tools that I really like, and we've been using this to make infographic, which is kind of like more engaging fact sheets in a way, is called PictoChart. So I kind of tend to think, especially when I'm trying to frame these big messages, try to think of every slide as an infographic. And marketers do this really well. So thinking, why not scientists? If you need icons, I've been using this thing called Flat Icon quite a bit. You can find a whole range of free icons that you can integrate into your presentation. It's really useful for me to have this available to me so I can use it as an alternative to bullet points. So instead of just like bullet points, I might use different icons to represent different pieces of my findings, for example. And particularly for me as a social scientist, the design piece gets really difficult because all of my data, everything that's related to my project is in words. It's all, a lot of times it's qualitative. Even if it's quantitative, there's not a lot of cool pictures that I can show for my project. So I do tend to use these icons quite a bit too. I think the other important thing, when you think of the content and how you present your content, and I hate to say this, but I see this quite a bit, is the use of statistics. When I was taking a statistics course here at the U over in EdPsych, this was really the first day of class for me, was the instructor talking about what's the right use of statistics? So the message here is don't be the drunken man or woman in this picture. So use statistics to focus more on the so what piece. So if you found a significant difference or whatever cool thing you did, what does it really mean? Don't just throw a whole bunch of statistics at your audience, and use it to further knowledge and further illuminate an idea instead of just you throwing numbers to your audience. So here's some slide examples that I found that I really liked. This one in particular is using a specific method called assertion evidence to make a slide, especially useful to show your findings. So up top, they're making an assertion about, before program, the majority of children felt just okay about science, and then what happened after the program. And then with the chart, then they're trying to provide the evidence for it. I've used this quite a bit, and the nice thing about it is it helps me to structure my content quite well. So then instead of having to talk about what I asked on the survey, for example, and then bring it back again when I present my results, I can go directly to this and say, here was the question on the survey and here's what we found, all in the same place. This one, very similar idea, just using different ways of visualizing the data, and just the idea of data visualization is becoming really huge and important, especially in areas of like science communication. So again, think about how can I best communicate this message, and think outside of the conventional ways of doing this with a simple bar chart that may not really show information really well. This one here has been useful in our group, billion-dollar graphics, to find out different ways of trying to depict and show the same data instead of using like a pie chart or a standard bar chart. And then sometimes you don't, maybe you don't even need a chart. Is there a need to show every single detail, every single level data and finding on your slides? Again, this might depend on the audience. So here's an example of a scientific finding that's presented quite well. It's all in words, there's no images, but just by using good design principles, this is a much better slide. Another example here, so you might use this type of a design to get a point across about what your research questions are. I could also see this becoming a really nice overview slide, or this very first title slide for your presentation. One of our colleagues who's not at the U anymore, but we do a lot of qualitative social science work, so we do a lot of interviews, and basically the data for interviews are going to be pages and pages of text. So a lot of projects, we might go out and interview watershed managers, or we interview farmers or landowners, residents, businesses, and our basic data really becomes just text, right? So interview, and then we transcribe the text. If we do 30 interviews, typically we end up having anywhere between 500 to 1,000 pages of text that we go through and analyze. And so this was one of the slides that one of my colleagues put together to show the extent of data analysis. And she used this quite a bit as kind of the background slide to talk about the methods she was using for analysis. Here's an example of, this pulled out of a report from one of the projects we were working on. And so instead of showing a simple table like this, you might also tweak this around and use more graphics to show your participant profile. Especially in our field, when we do interviews or surveys, this becomes really important. We have to show the social demographic and characteristics of the farmers or businesses that we've interviewed. Just a few more examples. I really like this I've tried doing this a lot for my presentations where I might put in my findings as a block of text with like some kind of background color and then have a background image that closely represents the message that I want to convey. So here's another slide that I've used quite a bit. So we do a whole bunch of surveys. We ask about, what do farmers, landowners think about conservation practices? And so there's a lot of the questions related to conservation practices. So this one in particular was, do they agree that conservation practices protects aquatic life? And there's a whole bunch of other ones that relate to, conservation practices help improve quality of life. They help communities and so forth. But for this particular slide and that particular audience on the day when I was presenting to a watershed board, they were really interested in knowing, do people really care about aquatic life and how conservation practices can help? And so instead of showing a bar chart for this, I just picked out that particular finding. Other kind of alternatives to showing bar charts, so working with different kind of shapes, different colors, different fonts, again, can be really useful in getting the point across. So this one message for the University of Minnesota, enough said, right, with just one slide. So this is not political, but I thought this was a really good slide that, again, uses the color combinations that relate to the political parties, by highlighting which one of these two candidates at the time had the higher percent rating for each one of these items. You can also easily kind of sort through the data and see, for things like economy, jobs, wealth, and stock market value, there's more support for Trump versus for other aspects, there's more support for Clinton. So I do like this slide. It conveys a lot of things on the same page. Although one thing I do want to point out about this is these icons, I think when they first came out were like pretty hip, but I think it's been kind of overused so many times that if you just like throw a whole bunch of these on a slide, then it doesn't look all that great. This has been used so much to show a whole bunch of different things, especially to do with population and socio-demographics and so forth. But still, I think this is still better than having bullet points, right? So this might be used as an alternative there. This is another good example. I think this was one of the slides that was presented as a good example for slide design at a presentation here at the U as well. Again, you might use a very simple slide design with just one background color thrown in. This could be a title slide, or this could be, here's my research question. And this one, so I'm using a very simple bar chart, but what I really wanted, the point that I wanted to get across to the audience, and this was presented to a watershed board, was that there's actually quite a significant number of people that said that they don't know about local water conditions, so they don't know about local water quality. So you can use different color combinations to try to get your major points across. All right, so I have activity 2. So we're kind of going to be a little bit more back and forth with this. So for each one of these examples, like this one, what do you think is done well in the slide? What do you think could be done better? Yeah.
I think that you can use many different things. For example, I think that you can use the color coding for the number 8 for lonely decline. That'll be a first thing you can do. And the second thing you can do is probably focus more on the distribution itself. you can also separate two maps. One is historical distribution, another one current distribution. The third one is make sure you make the distribution is still pop out. Because when you see this map, the first thing you see is lines. Those are very ineffective.
Okay, so more work on the map, right? So just the visual itself. Yeah, did you have?
So yeah, I think the visuals really trying to communicate a lot. But as with respect to the design of the slide, there's no visual hierarchy. You know, long leaf decline is tucked way up in there, whatever that means. And then you have this set of bullet points, which are the same font and almost the same font size as you go through them. And I'm assuming they're talking points, jumping off points. But,
yeah. Okay. Yeah, Casey, did you have?
I think you could add icons to like where it says big development, aggressive logging, and hiding fire suppression. You could just put like a flame.
So again, using more like visual aids instead of the text. Anything else that pops up? Yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea to make the map, but it seems like the map has been discretized into pretty small grids. So maybe they could just aggregate these grids into a larger one, so that the information will be more simple and straightforward. The message on the paper. And also I think the legend that the current distribution, although that's the red star, but it seems to confuse me a lot because the bullet point they used in terms of ideas almost the same as the legend. Just say it from here.
Yeah, I think, for me, honestly, I don't know what the message is here on this slide, right? What does current distribution or historic distribution mean? And what you're trying to show. And I think especially I think for me, because there's so much overlap between historic and current on the same map, it just looks like a bunch of shapes with dots in them without any kind of coherent message. And I also thought the text I don't know if that's even necessary to have that text on there, and maybe could have been on a different slide, or have it pop up at something else as you're talking through. It seemed like the text was there more for the presenter than for the audience, right? So then hopefully I don't forget to say it because I'd see it on the slide. Right, how about this one? Yeah.
If not visual, like telling which one's more important and things are important and what you already improved it. You first need to know which will be your emphasis first, and then figure out better what will you organize the hierarchy based on hierarchy.
Okay. Yeah.
Highlight it.
Casey, you had.
It's like it was a template, and so you can do a lot more of that.
Yeah, it was a template. It was one of our group slides, so feel free to tear it apart. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of text on there. I don't know what NRMP means. I think there's also, I don't necessarily think, does all the text need to be there? Just like different levels of bullets.
Especially since you can't even read it, it's so small.
Yeah.
Use the page.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with the template as well, just what color combinations can you even use for the bullet points, and how many of them you can have, and all those little details. So I think I would, if I do this again, I'd take this and say, first thing I would say to myself is don't use bullet points, and then try to see what other ways I can get this point across. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about a little bit is the Q&A, which creeps up on you like Samara Morgan from The Ring. Incidentally, my second daughter is also named Samara, which I only found out is also the name for this after I named her. Great. there was a lot of interest in previous years as well in talking about the Q&A session and maybe how to handle that. And I would definitely say I'm not really an expert at handling Q&A sessions because the time you have after your presentation, you get a bunch of questions and you really can't predict exactly what you'll get. But I would say that over the years, I've come to actually like and welcome the Q&A sessions because I think for me, it shows that people are actually interested and were listening to what I was saying. And there's a lot of interest, and by and large, people are very supportive, right? They're nice. Mostly people are nice and have questions that show that they have a lot of interest in what you're doing. So I think definitely don't be scared of the Q&A piece of your presentation, and make sure that that you do have set aside that time for that Q&A piece to be able to answer questions. The other nice thing is, in a very different way, I think it becomes an opportunity to network with people. So if you get people asking you questions, then you're already interacting with someone, and then that builds up a place where you can go back to them and get to know them a little bit better. So I tend to get a lot of different kinds of questions. You might get a lot of technical questions like why did you use exactly this method, or blah, blah, blah kind of thing, which typically should be easier for you to answer. The other type of question that you might get is just like questioning your entire existence in this research project, right? I've got a lot of those. I think particularly as a social scientist, I've even had questions in stakeholder meetings where it's like, is this even science? I don't know if this is even science. I think for me, what I would say about that is not about is this even science, but about handling questions is just kind of staying as calm as you can, and also knowing that it's okay to not know. So if you get stumped by a question, it's okay to say, I don't know, or that's outside of the scope of my work. I deal with a lot of social psychological theories, and I get a bunch of questions about, did you use this theory X, Y, and Z that I have never heard of in my life? And so I might just, follow up with a question of, can you explain what that means? And then, see if there's any tie-in with what I'm doing. And, I might even respond with, that's beyond the scope of this work, and that's an interesting idea, and then you can even follow up and talk to them about that at another point too. And you can ask me a whole bunch of other Q&A related questions when we do the Q&A for this session. I'll make sure I have time for that. The other question that Tracy had asked me, I think there was some interest, is the poster sessions. I'm kind of thinking more in terms of the oral presentation, the oral, these concurrent sessions that go at conferences, but there's also poster session, which are great. The nice thing about posters is that you can have all of your messages in the same place at the same time. What I would say is that the poster should be able to stand on its own. So even if you're not around, then it should be able to get the point across. And I know it gets kind of awkward sometimes when you do posters, like, am I supposed to go and talk to everyone that's walking around, or just wait for questions? I think either one, you can get a feel for what's going on around you for your approach, and you can use whatever works best for you. But one thing I think is most useful to do is to have a very brief description in your mind of what's on your poster. So be able to describe, what did you do that, again, going back to that what, why, and so what. So what did you do? Why is it important? What are the major findings? And why would this audience member care? A lot of the details of it are actually handled when someone has interest in your poster, goes through it, and then starts asking questions about the poster. And so it ends. When I did posters, I feel like it ends up becoming kind of the Q&A session of your oral presentation, because it's just a lot of questions that are coming your way, which is good. It's again shows that people are interested in your work. So typically you might have a setting like this, right, where there's a whole bunch of posters. This is certainly true for the Water Resources Conference, but at a much smaller scale. So you get, a lot of space for posters, and you have it there throughout the conference. But again, remember that, all of these design principles for a slide could also work for a poster. And that make sure that what you have on your poster is a good balance between the text and the description of the work you do and any visual aids that you use. All right. And then as people are coming by, you actually don't have a whole lot of time to introduce your research. So really work on that elevator speech. And this is also great for if you're looking for jobs, right? You have to know what you're doing and be able to explain it to different types of audiences. So what I like to do is kind of think again, go back to that. What project or what research am I doing? Why is it important? What problem is it addressing? And what's the significance of what I'm finding out? And so I would say you actually have less than 60 seconds to actually address someone. Right. I have this activity 3, which I think given the time, I am actually going to use this as a after 4 p.m. For those folks that want to stick around, or a take-home exercise, where what I essentially want you to do is think about that elevator speech. So how would you describe your research to someone, whether that's at a conference or any other setting, in 3 to 5 sentences. So it shouldn't take you more than 20, 30 seconds to very briefly describe what you do, what is your research about, and what does this all mean. And finally, it's over. And I'll take any questions. Questions? Yes, Casey.
So you said that one of the things I do is to use images as the background and then text up. So how does sourcing your images work? Do you just put it in the bottom of the screen?
Yeah, often that's what I oftentimes do. And I use Creative Commons a lot. Have you used yeah, so they have, one nice thing is they have really high quality images that you can also search for based on licensing. And typically for educational use, there are not very many licensing restrictions, but I still provide for every image I use, regardless of whether or not it's, it has free license. I try to have some kind of, even if it's just a web link to where I found the image. So kind of think of it like citing different sources. Any other questions for me?
How much extra time does it take you to make a presentation like this rather than one that has a template and sort of a standard format?
I would say it does actually take me a lot more extra time to put things together. The nice thing that I've found is that once I work through a few of them, then I kind of create my own design templates after that. And I might just, make a duplicate of a slide that I already have, and then change the content within it and tweak a few things around in it. But I think it's more, for me, it's been more incremental. So I don't try to apply everything into one presentation. I might say, okay, here's this finding that I think would work really well with this kind of design, and try to kind of incrementally build up. But to be honest, it does take a lot more time, to find images that, if you're using image as a background, to find really good images that actually make sense with what you're actually trying to convey, and work through the design piece of it. There are a lot of websites that provide these better design templates that are more open in terms of how you can move things around and tweak it. And so I look through a lot of presentations and say, oh yeah, I really like that, how that's designed, and try to incorporate that. Which also reminds me, one thing in terms of the fonts that sometimes can end up being a problem is, you found a really cool example of a slide and you try to use that slide design, and you have to download additional fonts to do it. And then, like today, if I have to use a different computer then to show that slide, that computer may not have those fonts downloaded. So try to find a set of fonts that is kind of common across different computers. I think some of the ones that I've liked are, I think I've also made a commitment to not use Calibri and Times New Roman on my slides, and try to use like Rockwell or Garamond or Helvetica is probably one of the most common fonts that you can find in pretty much every system. And it's a very simple kind of font. Yeah, any other questions?
So how often, as a kind of a follow-up, how often do you find yourself going from a blank page, no template, to final slide design? Like, do you have a process? Is it intimidating?
Yeah, I usually just start out with a blank slide, and it also depends on how much time you have, right? To be realistic, there's so many different things that you got to do. You have to teach, and as grad students, you got to write your thesis, which should be done in 2 days. It's not a big deal. But there's usually I start with like a completely blank slide, white, and then try to add elements to it and see how it looks. And then I always have like these good example slides that I like to compare it against and see, okay, am I getting close to that kind of design standard or not? I like to have like people take a look at it and see if they think this looks good. I oftentimes use my TV at home and hook it up and see like when it looks, it's a little bit bigger, does it look a little bit better? Sometimes on a smaller screen it doesn't. Some designs don't look quite as nice. Maybe on a bigger screen they look a little bit better. So try different things. But it does take me quite a bit of time to go from that blank slide to having a slide that I feel satisfied with. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Are there any other presentation formats that you would recommend?
Like other than using like Microsoft PowerPoint, I've seen like a lot of people use Prezi, but it's nice I think for certain things. But for me, to be honest, it makes me a little dizzy to look at Prezi because it just kind of spins around all the time. But I think at its core, they're very similar. I've heard Keynote is better in terms of design, but I have no idea, absolutely no idea how to use a Mac. I don't even know how to click on a Mac, so I wouldn't use Keynote. But if you use Mac, I've heard that the color palettes and everything are much better. Now I think you can also use, you can import color combinations from Adobe. I found that works a lot better. Their color combinations and the color itself look much better within Adobe than with Microsoft. And you can fine-tune the color palettes a little bit better too. But I've always only used PowerPoint, or I've also done some where I didn't use any visual aids at all. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks so much.
I have to stop it.
Do I stop share?
I'll do it.